archaeology and anthropology, like the science of it is really exploding. So a lot of my, the first 5 years or so of my career focusing on this was really dedicated to like understanding ancient DNA, which is only, it's not a huge part of the book, but that's really like where a lot of the energy in archaeology and understanding the past has been. And these kind of new, very, very technical science, like sciencey techniques, and so trying to wrap my head around, yeah, those technicalities, explain it to a general audience in a compelling way, and just the sense that you could ask questions about the past. Not only that you could answer questions about the past that you never thought you'd get the answers to, but you could ask questions that you never thought to ask before, based on these tools. And I think that was really fun. And then one story that really comes to mind that kind of led to some of the ideas in this book was I did a story in 2019 going into the jungle in Chiapas to look for like a lost Maya city, which is like, you know, the lost city concept is obviously big in archaeology, and most archaeologists will tell you it's kind of overblown. Like most uh, lost cities are known by the people who live around them, or are kind of enshrined in the mythology of archaeology and history, based on basically like indigenous people trying to get explorers to like leave them alone and go somewhere else. And they're like, oh, there's this great other place like just over there, and that's how a lot of these stories ended up with us. But this one was a real city, and it was a Maya capital that was founded and existed for, I think, almost 200 years after the Spanish first arrived in the Yucatan and the Maya world. And, they were hidden on purpose. They didn't want anything to do with colonialism, the Catholic Church, this new economy that Europe was creating. And they just said, no, thank you. We'll be over here. And the it took Europeans almost 200 years to find it. Again, of course, only with the help of local people who eventually told them where it was. And the site is, yeah, lost in this national park in Mexico. And I went there with archaeologists. We didn't find it. They have since found it, I've been told. But on our trip, we didn't find it. But it really, I went there thinking like, oh, the story is like how these people stayed hidden for so long. But then when I came out, I was like, no, actually, the story is how did anyone ever find them? Because these jungles are impenetrable, like especially for people who have no idea what they're doing, like me, um, and like these people from Spain who would have arrived wearing like full woolen, like clothes made of wool and suits of armor and stuff. I mean, it was just a nightmare. And that really made me think like, oh, okay, these stories that we've like I've been learning a lot of these stories about the past kind of backwards, and what would it look like if I kind of tried to flip the perspective. I first got the idea for Apocalypse, how catastrophe transformed our world and can forge new futures, by it arose from talking to a lot of archaeologists over the years, and um, kind of seeing that the stories they were finding about the ends of societies, societal collapse, sea level rise, even human extinction, climate change, like were not really the stories that I had heard about these past events or had been led to believe these things were like. The archaeologists were able to explore them in much more detail than I had anticipated or thought was possible. And they were really finding stories of recovery and survival and resilience, and not necessarily easy that any of those things were easy, but I think a lot of the popular conceptions around these events, especially when it has to do with past climate change, because we are so rightfully scared of climate change in our own timeline, is that it's this wave of destruction that humans have no control over, and more importantly, no control in how they react to. And that is not really what archaeologists find. I mean, archaeologists are very focused on the human story and what humans did in reaction to these things. And I just thought, wow, this really isn't like like why aren't these stories are so much more interesting, they're so much better, and they're like more correct. And like why are these stories not finding their way to the general public? And I thought, and I do a story here and there um about, I don't know, the classic Maya, and then at the end refer to the collapse, or I'd done a few stories like, yeah, the Sakbalam story about colonialism. Um, but it just felt like it needed an overarching idea to sort of like unite these concepts into under one umbrella, and to really like hopefully help it break through that like these stories are more complicated and often more interesting and more hopeful, and I think much more fascinating than these kind of old, boring stories of death and destruction that we've had like shoved down our throats for decades, if not centuries. I was like, oh, this happens to journalists a lot. It's like, what if I just tell it chronologically, and like that. The book isn't quite chronological. There's a few exceptions, but I thought, okay, what if I want this to be sort of a sweeping look at the human past? Why don't we start as far back as we really have good research on, which is, um, or good research for my purposes, which is the extinction of the Neanderthals, and which is about 40,000 years ago. And I don't know, the idea of the structure kind of like shimmered into being like within 5 minutes, of course, after like 6 months of racking my brain about it and getting nowhere. And so I would say it really was one of those like magic of the subconscious moments in writing that are like so unpredictable and great when they happen. Um, but I thought, you know, I think starting with Neanderthals was really, really worked for me and worked for the book and worked for like sort of trying to get my own idea, like my own head around what some of the larger arguments in the book were going to be. Because, when I went back and read some of the early scientific papers about the discovery of the Neanderthals from the 19th century, I was just, um, I was struck by by how little our ideas about them had changed, or like the general public's ideas about Neanderthals had changed. Like they were this sort of mysterious and inferior species that had gone extinct in the face of competition from, an obviously like better suited competitor, being Homo sapiens. Like we had beat them somehow in this contest of evolution. Those ideas are like right from the earliest papers in there. And I was also really struck, and maybe I shouldn't have been that surprised considering what I know about the history of anthropology, but I was really surprised at how racist these papers were. Like that just incredibly, incredibly racist. And, that like the idea of the whole motivating force behind anthropology at that time, and especially physical anthropology, was to kind of define racial categories, enshrine them that were, were existing in the world, and they were like looking for a biological basis for them, which, of course we know now there's not really one, but that's what they really wanted to do. And they were like obsessed with grouping humans into different kinds of categories and putting them in a hierarchy. And so Neanderthals fit perfectly into that project. And that's what they did. And I was like really shocked by how yeah, by how much we had absorbed these ideas that clearly had such a an ugly history, and I think a history that many people would reject and would think was quite obviously biased and wrong. Like it's not, you don't have to do like close critical reading. It's like right there, and like and so I just thought, wow, this is like I think, and the science has progressed so much recently about Neanderthals. The whole conception of who they were has been revealed to be, completely wrong, completely driven by these biases. And I thought like that was an extreme but illustrative example of how these old ideas have kind of gotten enshrined, where we don't even really realize where they're coming from, and like how um how much we deserve a better story, like how much it's once you dig into to the details of their origins, how obvious it is that we deserve a better story. And I just thought, I want to write that better story.